Have you ever wondered why data breaches are so common? I mean, it seems like companies are always being breached, and some of them get hit more than once. And you're kind of like, what? How did you get breached again? It's frustrating, right? Well, sometimes these companies are all suffering from a critical oversight. That critical oversight, what is it? Well, I want to tell you coming up next. Hey everybody, Michael ATT&CK. Today, I want to chat with you about a critical oversight in combating data breaches. I want to actually talk about specifically what critical oversight companies are missing. Now, data breaches, there's a lot of reasons why they happen, but there's one element that is quite pivotal that a lot of companies just don't really get. Let's dive into this. Before we get started, I think we need to do a mindset shift. Let's talk about a burglary. You're like, well, Michael, what does a burglary have to do with this critical oversight? Actually, quite a bit. So let's look at this house. If you look at this house, that's a nice home. Let's pretend you're a criminal. And if you watch any of my other segments or have heard me talk about criminals, we all are criminals, candidly. So use your criminal mind. How would you break into this house? There's probably a number of ways you're thinking, like, well, we could just simply go through the front door. That's an obvious choice, a bunch of windows there. This is what criminals think. They think about how to break into things. Hackers are doing the same thing like a burglar would. So they're gonna figure out pattern of life, meaning when is the person home, when they're not home? Who lives there? Who are these people? Hackers do the exact same thing for networks. But this is the mindset shift. I want us to all think about this. We'll keep coming back to this house analogy because this is quite pivotal. So again, we're burglars, we're trying to go after this one house, and if you're trying to defend this house, we need to think about countermeasures to burglary. Door locks, external cameras watching the house. So there are some deterrents. All right, so let's get back into the presentation. Let's look at the numbers. So let's take a look at the biggest data breaches of 2019. So Zynga, 218 million. Dubsmash, 161.5 million. Capital One, 100 million. So that's the number of records stolen for each one. Those are the top three in 2019. That's a tremendous amount of data. And when you look at these companies like Capital One, it's a massive organization. How did they lose that many records? What could have happened? Now, I highlight this because this is a constant issue. If you Google 2018 biggest data breaches or 2020 data breaches, they're all massive and they keep adding up and they're not going away. So there's a categorical issue that a lot of these organizations are missing. Okay, so we established there's a definite problem. Let's look at some industry data. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to talk about two key industry benchmarks. So the first one I want to chat about is Mitre. I want to look specifically at Mitre's attack matrix. You might be wondering, Michael, who's Mitre? Mitre, a nonprofit organization working in the public interest across federal, state, and local governments, as well as industry and academia. So that's who Mitre is. Basically, they're funded from multiple areas, but they're a non-profit organization. I'm going to be talking specifically about their attack matrix. So what is their attack matrix? Well, let's take a look. There's 12 components of their attack matrix. They're all listed out here. Essentially what this is, these are the steps a hacker or a person behind a data breach would take if they're going to go target your network, 1 through 11. The last one, impact, is just highlighting the impact it has to the organization itself. Now, this is a whole separate video talking about these 12 elements. I'm only going to talk about the first one, initial access. This is what we're all trying to defend against when a hacker first makes access into your network. All right, so let's focus on initial access. Let's take a look at 3 techniques used by hackers according to Mitre. These are the first 3 they highlight. Drive-by compromise. Drive-by compromise is kind of what it sounds like. These are sites that are susceptible to attack from malicious code, looking at elements that are external to the site, such as JavaScript or iframes or cross-site scripting. These are all things that a hacker can exploit quite easily if the site is susceptible to them, and many of them are. So that's one technique. The second technique Mitre covers is exploit public-facing application. So hackers will take advantage of various applications that are public-facing. So some public-facing applications could include a SQL database or a Microsoft SMB server, or potentially SSH or secure shell. These are all components that are publicly facing. Another attack vector that hackers will exploit. The third one Mitre covers is external remote services. This could be a VPN, Citrix, or any type of mechanism that allows someone outside your network to connect to internal elements within your network. Critical component like VPN, there's a good one right there. That is something that many organizations are going to basically have available. Hackers know that, and they take advantage of those systems. Many VPN servers are misconfigured, or the encryption they use is somewhat weak. They have multiple exposures that are susceptible and eventually become vulnerabilities. Okay, so those are the three elements I want to cover. Let's go back into the house analogy. How does that play in? Well, these are all things that allow you or hacker to gain access to your network. Look at the house. You're a burglar. How are you going to go in there? Windows, doors, all elements that are susceptible to compromise. Those things I described, windows and doors, those are things you can see from the outside. So going back to those three elements that I talked about, the key takeaway here is these all deal with internet-facing asset types. By internet-facing, I mean they are something that you can see from outside that organization. Okay, let's go to the second industry report I want to chat about. Most of the remainder of this conversation will be talking about this. Let's look at the 2020 Data Breach Investigations Report done by Verizon. So you're like, Verizon does this? Yeah. Verizon's DBIR is the gold standard in data breach reporting. This year's report looked at 3,950 breaches. So that's a pretty good sample set. So we're gonna dive a little bit deeper on some components that Verizon highlights in the report. So to talk about data breaches, let's talk about something that kind of gets me a little irritated in movies. Have you noticed hackers in movies are always depicted like this? It's like cool, hip music, like dimly lit room, monitors everywhere. That's not really what hackers are like. They're more like this guy. That's kind of what hackers are like, at least my experience. Now, I say that it's sort of unjust. They're not all like that. They're actually more like this last guy. Just a normal dude. Hackers, they run the gambit. Now, some of them are definitely a little bit more socially awkward, but some are just normal people. If you look at them, they look like normal guys. And most of them are men, by the way. But that was one of the things I highlight, because it's funny because you watch these shows on television and movies, and I'm just like, that's not what hackers look like, but it's kind of funny that we in society now start thinking that. Okay, anyway, all right, let's get back into this Verizon report. What motivates hackers? Well, this is kind of easy. Over 80% of breaches were financially motivated. They're motivated by money, like most of us. So that's kind of understandable. So, duh, Verizon, what else you got? All right, what tactics are utilized? So this is something Verizon sort of digs deeper into. The number one tactic used by data breaches is hacking at 45%. The next two are social and error, tied at 22%. So social engineering, that's a technique whereby you or someone who's been victimized feels that they're involved in a trusted communication and they're tricked into doing something. So what is error? Error is just when you make a mistake and you fall prey to a breach. And that's error. All right, but the number one component here is hacking. That's a big takeaway, and by quite a few, but by quite a few margin. 45 to 22 is the second place one. A lot of hacking going on. Now, hacking, Verizon divides into three parts. Number one, those utilizing stolen or brute force credentials. Number two, those exploiting vulnerabilities. And three, attacks using backdoors and command and control functionality. So those are the three groups that hacking is divided into. I want to chat about the top two. The third one, attacks using backdoors and command and control or C2 functionality, that is actually something that's much lower in terms of the volume and more sophisticated and many times in line with a nation state actor. So I'm not going to dig deeper into that. Let's highlight the first two, the big ones. Utilizing stolen or brute force credentials. This is actually quite large in terms of the volume of hacks. In reviewing connection attempts by ports over time in honeypot data, the two most targeted ports were SSH port 22 and Telnet port 23. Okay, so what is that saying? So what's a honeypot? Honeypot is simply just a server that's been set up purposefully to lure someone into it. Researchers use this to sort of monitor behavior. There's other purposes of having a honeypot, but generally speaking, that's what they're used for. So they're open, they're basically something that is out there to try to lure somebody. So when Verizon was looking at this information, the vast majority of these honeypots, the data they combed through, most of the time, hackers were going after port 22 and port 23. Again, that's SSH, Secure Shell, or Telnet. What are those? Those are just protocols typically used to log into a server. So these protocols are the ones hackers are targeting most. Let's go back to the house analogy. How do ports line up with that analogy? So think of a port like you would a door or a window. Ports allow people to send data. Now there's a whole slew of ports. You have your basic common ports and you have your ethereal ports. I won't get into the specifics, but just know there's a bunch of ways information is exchanged from an end user to a server. And again, think of this like a window or a door. So you're like, well, why don't you just shut off all the ports? Well, you can. However, if you shut off all your ports, then essentially you can't communicate with the outside world. So think of that as your home. If you basically had no doors, no windows, well, would it really be that useful? I mean, it's somewhat secure. I mean, actually it's very secure, but it's not functional. You can never leave your house or go into it. So you have to have ways in and out. That is what essentially these ports are. They're ways for data to come in and out. Generally speaking, these are all controlled, monitored in theory, right? But sometimes they're not. Just like a home. If you have your front door and it's locked and it's a good lock, that's awesome. Maybe you have a webcam that's helping monitor it. That's another type of security. Networks have something called intrusion detection, intrusion prevention systems. Those monitor what's happening in and out of ports. So there's definitely a lot of parallels here. So that's what ports are. They're ways in and out of network, just like doors and windows are ways in and out of your home. Okay, let's look at exploiting vulnerabilities. Quote, hosts susceptible to major new vulnerabilities tend to also be defenseless against many older vulnerabilities. So you have a new vulnerability, and then Verizon found that when they look at that server, they realized it was susceptible to an older vulnerability. So that's interesting. So hold that thought, because that actually pertains to something Verizon concludes later on. Let's move on to the overview of the asset landscape. The most targeted assets are servers. Over 60% of hackers target servers. That makes sense if you think about it. Servers are what's out there and that are customer facing. So hackers are going to take advantage of that more than other types of elements. The other element here is the actual user. That is another big component that hackers are targeting, but generally speaking, they're going after the server. All right, let's talk about an asset management problem. This is one of the key findings that Verizon identified. Approximately 43% of internet-facing IPs are in one network. However, most organizations have 5 or more networks. In other words, 57% of IPs that are internet-facing are linked to other networks, not the main core network of a company. So hold that thought. Let's step back and put these two components together. You add that with something else we chatted about earlier. Hosts being susceptible to major new vulnerabilities tend to also be defenseless against many older ones. So this was interesting. Verizon opined that what this meant was that this was indicative that it's possible that companies aren't aware of these old systems or networks that are outside their main network. All the subsidiary networks or business units, potentially companies aren't aware of them. They lose track of them. So if you think about it, you have so many assets out there. You have your main network, and generally speaking, your system administrator and IT are on that one. But you have all these other networks that are secondary, and you have to patch everything. Well, if you tie it all together, what's potentially happening is they're forgetting they have these networks, or they didn't even know they have these networks, or assets. They lose track of them, or no one ever told them they have these assets. This is an indication of an asset management problem. So you're like, okay, hold on. So what are you saying? Well, let's go look at our house analogy. Remember we have this one house. And you're like, okay, yeah, I got this house. Now let's pretend we're not the attacker, we're defending it. If you're defending this house, it should be relatively easy because this is the only home you have. So you can like calculate, okay, how many windows are there? Where are they located? Where are the doors? Where's the garage? Where's the doggy door? Don't forget the doggy door. If you have a doggy door, you gotta lock that thing down. So You have all these components, you know your assets, because it's one asset. What if you're part of a family, you guys are like real estate moguls, and all of a sudden you have a bunch of property. And because you have so many family members that are facilitating acquisitions of new properties, you kind of lose track of it. Now, if it's small enough, you're like, okay, well, we'll keep track of it on a spreadsheet. But would you really know if your wife all of a sudden made some purchases? Maybe. What about crazy Uncle Harry? That dude's nuts. He makes really bad purchases. Would you track everything? Maybe, but he might purchase something that you don't know anything about. So it becomes kind of convoluted. Now, what if your family was to be really good and all of a sudden they have assets across the city? Now, all of a sudden it becomes much harder to track. We take the next level, not even the city, but the country, the globe. That's many times the problem in these corporate networks. They have so many assets, thousands upon hundreds of thousands of assets that are floating across the globe. Think about big companies. They do mergers and acquisitions. They're bringing in assets from another company. For them to track all of it, it's extremely cumbersome and hard to do. So what Verizon was saying was they're basically highlighting there are so many assets or so many networks, they lose track of them. And they can't figure out which is theirs because they don't know, because no one ever shared it with the system administrator. This is a major problem. So what's the key takeaway here? The key takeaway is hacking servers via targeted user credentials is the most prevalent and successful type of attack. Knowing what assets are yours is critical to protection. If you tie everything together in the Verizon's report, this was something that's quite pivotal. And I think sometimes lost in the report because there's so much good data in there. So think of that analogy I just described. If you have houses all over the globe, how are you supposed to track them? So if hackers are going after servers and they're using credentials to break into these servers, you need to be tracking all of your assets. So tying it all together. Let's look at this house. You're like, oh, cool, another house. Now, again, this is that example where you have houses all over the globe. And we'll say this one is a house you own. You're like, awesome, I love this house. Well, you don't know you own this house because in Santa Monica, California, it's crazy Uncle Harry, he bought it. And that was an awesome purchase. But Uncle Harry is very unreliable. He didn't tell you that. So look at this house, it's a really nice house. There's probably some items inside this home that a burglar would find extremely valuable and really want to go after. You have two big, huge vulnerabilities here. And now in your defense, you don't even know this house is yours. Uncle Harry bought it, never told you, but if it gets breached, that's a problem. And this is what happens many times in these data breaches. Companies don't know where all their assets are. They lose track of them because of some merger and acquisition, because marketing is so aggressive, they're buying new domain names, because they have a group of developers that are trying to get something developed and they create a new server out there so they can spin up something. There's a whole litany of things that are happening. And if you don't know all your assets and where they're located, it's impossible for you to protect them. So that is the critical oversight in combating data breaches. You have to know where all your assets are located. So that's it for this video. I'd love to hear your comments down below. Does it make sense? Do you know where all your assets are located? And how many of you have an Uncle Harry? That is just a crazy dude. I actually have an uncle. He might watch this. I don't want to say who it is. He's kind of crazy, actually. Anyway, so comment down below. If you like this content, hit the like button. If you want to see more things like this, subscribe to my channel. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, Twitter, whatever social media application you can find me on. So I'm also on Instagram, but it's kind of like my personal account. Don't find me on Instagram because there's a bunch of jokes. It's probably not appropriate. Anyway, that's it for me. I'll chat with you guys next time.